Welcome to the Republican Professor. I'm your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. Today is Wednesday, 20 May, 2026 years after Jesus. Like I said, it is a Wednesday. And we're doing the next in a series on the celebrating the 250th anniversary of the United States of America. So this year, buddy, I'm actually on staff at an Anglican church, and I like to tell the British guy, he's actually an American citizen, but he sounds like C.S. Lewis because he was actually educated in London and British citizenship, I believe. But anyway, this guy, I like to tell him we're an Anglican church, except on July 4th when we become an Anglicant church. England can't. Okay, well, it sounds better in person. You had to be there. We're in the creation of the presidency, a study in constitutional history. And these guys mostly were Anglicans. So, we're right. Oh man, this is just good stuff. It's a study, it's a deep study on executive power. And I don't just mean executive power in government, I mean executive power per se. Executive power per se. We stopped at page 33 at the top, and this is called The Creation of the The Creation of the Presidency, A Study in Constitutional History by Charles C. Thach Jr., published by Liberty Fund Incorporated, Indianapolis, Indiana. We would like to thank Liberty Fund for making this material available, and we'd like to thank Charles C. Thach Jr. for writing it. Charles C. Thach Jr. His dates are 1894 to 1966, and that's AD, not BC. I know some of you might, I'm glad you're glad I put that in there. Received his Ph.D. from Johns Hopkins University in 1922. That's also AD. Specializing in political theory, he taught at the University of Minnesota and Johns Hopkins. He later became a professor of government at New York University, where he taught for over 30 years. This is great stuff. And recall, here's the issue. You got the colonies in America. There's a king, King George the Third. His last name was the Third. Strange last name, I know. But King George the Third became the target of some criticism based on observation, common sense, morality, common law, parliamentary law, and stuff. And Parliament was also an object of the criticism. Okay, so you had the king and Parliament. That system had developed over hundreds of years in England, and basically on the British system's own rules, they were violating their own rules, but also they were violating natural law. That is to say, the uh, the reality of morality as God has baked it into the very nature of the world. And so, who do you go with when there's a conflict between what is right and what someone powerful, or at least someone who says they're powerful, or maybe is powerful, but doesn't really deserve that power? What happens in this conflict? If you've ever seen the film A Man for All Seasons, it is about this. I think it was 1966. Fantastic film. If you haven't seen it, you need to get it on DVD. And if you don't have a DVD player, you need to get one now. Get it and make sure that the people cannot take it from you. Get the DVD now. A Man for All Seasons is the story of the opposition to the founder of Anglicanism, who was King Henry the Eighth. Strange last name, I know. The Eighth is a very odd name. I don't know what it comes from, but it is an embarrassing feature of my broad denomination, Anglicanism, which is a version of Protestantism. It's embarrassing that it was founded by King Henry VIII and the Parliament who blessed and ratified a lot of the stuff that he was doing. I'm not saying it's embarrassing that he broke from Rome. I'm not disagreeing with that at all because I'm a Protestant and I agree with that. What's embarrassing is that this guy, I mean, you think Donald Trump is bad? You think Donald Trump's tweets are bad? Let me just tell you what the founder of Anglicanism did. And remember, this is my, I'm on staff. I'm not, I'm not a spokesperson, but I am on staff and have been for a long time, appointed by the rector in my duties. Okay. Um, who's a personal friend of mine. We went to seminary together. Um, King Henry VIII would burn to the stake any priest who didn't include in his sermon a note to the congregation, the parish congregation, who, by the way, oftentimes could not even understand scripture as it was being read widely because of the Latin issue, which was later resolved. But he would have them burned at the stake if they did not include a little segment of the sermon saying that his daughter, under Anne Boleyn, who was Elizabeth I, was the true next queen of England, not Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. If they didn't put that in the sermon, they were burned at the stake. I mean, you thought that Donald Trump's tweets were bad. This is in the early 1500s. Now, let me just add another detail here that may be interesting to you. This is before the United States, but this is leading up to the kind of crap that people were dealing with that led to the founding of our country. Okay? Just giving you the background here. And I'm only going to do Henry VIII. I'm not going to do anything else. I'm only going to do one more detail of Henry VIII. Anne Boleyn was the mother of this young baby, Elizabeth, who was the object of the dispute between these priests who were being burned at the stake if they didn't put that in the daggum sermon. Okay. So you would think that Henry VIII really loves Anne Boleyn and hates Catherine of Aragon. Well, you'd be correct. And guess how he treated her? He beheaded her. The mother of Elizabeth I, who was one of the greatest queens in the history of the world. That's how he treated her mother, who, by the way, he said, if you don't recognize her daughter, priest, death. Um, guys, this background, this denominational background, is not irrelevant to the creation of the presidency. It's all the same. It's not exactly the same topic, but it's not irrelevant to what's going on here. Okay. Um, the issue of executive power was monarchical. Okay. and there were reflections from John Locke, and Montesquieu, some of these philosophers like Thomas Hobbes. You can read all about that stuff. The founders of the United States were intimately familiar with all of that history, and they were extremely bothered by it. But at the same time, they were trying to create and found a new country. And they tried to do it, a lot of them, when they turned the colonies into states. They tried to do it without executive power or with really minimal executive power. Like I said, the previous episode, which was in March, wait, sorry, it was in April, sorry, um, of 2026. I said in previous episodes that the they tried to do it without an executive, without a strong executive. Why? Because they were afraid of monarchs. And how could you not blame them? Look at the kind of crap they were dealing with. Just read the Declaration of Independence. Most of it is a list of abuses. It's an argument. Here's all our premises, and then there's the practical conclusion based on practical reason. Look up Aristotle, look up Thomas Aquinas. We must do this. We must do this because of these abuses. It's a matter of conscience. We have to stand up against the king. We don't just take the king's authority for whatever. Why? Because the king is abusive. The authority is abusive. And there's a long history of this in the scriptures. So where do you think they were getting their backbone from? Just read the prophets in the Old Testament. How many prophets in the Old Testament were themselves kings? Just let you sit with that. You can look that up. You can research it. How many of them were executive figures? Now, that's not exactly a topic. We are covering that topic on the podcast in the wonderful series we're doing on F. F. Bruce's History of Israel and the Nations. Check that episode out. We're going to do next time. It's great stuff, especially with Israel and Iran and stuff like going on now. And I do make comments about some of that stuff. Not that you care about my comments or that they're authoritative in any way. It's just food for thought. It's just a way of understanding the world. Okay. It's just to help you move the ball down the road here and your own understanding. Okay. So going back to this, they didn't have a concept of a president. They had a concept of a governor. That goes back to Rome. Remember, Pontius Pilate was a governor. Okay. That's top-down authority, though. The governor is appointed by the emperor at that time. Now, it may be ratified by the Senate, but what I mean is it's top-down, right? In other words, it's not elected governor like we have. It's bottom up with us, bottom up. So they were trying to figure out, you do need an executive, you need a strong executive, and if you need, why do you need a strong executive? Well, this is what the story Thach is telling. You need the strong executive because if you have an executive that has no independence whatsoever, no tenure, no, you might say, due process for disputes, like when people criticize him. Because if he does the right thing, he's going to get criticized all the time because people are sinful. So you have to give the guy some wiggle room to operate and to have the courage to do the right thing, even when it's unpopular. And Charles Thach tells the story of how the Americans, originally the colonists, then the early ones that under the Articles of Confederation, they figured out the Articles of Confederation suck, mainly because there's no dadgum strong executive. There's also no independent court. But this is not about that. It's about the executive. So this is about executive power. And we're in the second chapter. We're going to do a fair use of this, make a transformative reading of this. And we'd like to thank Liberty Fund for making this available. We'd like to thank Charles C. Thach Jr. for writing it. Now, we're on page 33 at the top. We ended with the pardon power was vested in the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the speaker. There was no provision for a veto power or any other organic control of the legislature. And that was speaking about Massachusetts, their constitution. Okay, page 33 at the top. But this constitution failed of ratification, and in the process of rejection, the various towns drafted addresses in which were included the objections which led to their action, and also constructive recommendations of principles which they desired to see embodied in a new instrument. Easily the most important of these was the so-called Essex result. This document, from the pen of a future state chief justice, that would be Massachusetts, may be fairly considered as representative of conservative Massachusetts opinion. And there is a typo. Liberty Fund, you got a typo in there, bub. Its criticisms of the proposed executive department are are illuminating. It was objected that the governor ought not to be a member of the Senate. He was its president. That the property qualifications of the office were too low. That the executive powers were too small. That the Senate's control over the executive was improper. In the words of the result is capitalized, and it's the criticism of this proposed constitution as it pertains to executive power. Quote, the supreme executive office is not vested with sufficient authority, and an independence between the executive and the legislative authority is not preserved. That the method of making appointments was exceptional, that the pardon power was improperly divided. Very good. Okay, so they're seeing, for example, if you're going to have a pardon power, you can't spread that out like peanut butter. You can't put it in a committee. It'll die in committee. Pardons usually need to be done pretty quickly because if it the whole point of a pardon power is that there's a recognition that the judicial result can be flawed. So if you find out apart from the judicial result that there really is an innocent person suffering, you got to get them out immediately. You can't let that die in committee. So they're saying, for example, here's one executive power, pardon power. You can't be divided. It has to be unified. It's got to be one person. One person. Does this mean that this one person who can override a judgment from a court of law, does that mean that that one person is not accountable? No, it doesn't mean that. It means as it pertains to that particular decision at that time, that particular pardon, yes, totally unaccountable on that, in the sense that you can't override his pardon. But it doesn't mean he's unaccountable for that decision. In another sense, in that sense is he runs for election and that's going to be a factor and if he gets reelected, right? So that's the accountability that they have. And so you can't have them so accountable that the whatever latest faction is loudest and most passionate, and usually they're the dumbest, and they have their heads in the sand and they don't do their due process and proper research. They're not known for patience. Okay. They're known for passion, right? And a passion can take over a faction and they can wreak absolute havoc if you don't build in strength in the executive where they can resist, one man can resist a faction. And so this is a story in, for example, Massachusetts of building in protections for the executive so that the executive can do the right thing because people are flawed and sinful. And when they get in groups, they're even worse. They're even worse. People usually don't become better people in groups. It's just not, you don't see, like, for example, ethical monotheism, key teachings in the Old Testament. these prophets are not hanging around in groups and voting and doing committee. That's not the key feature of prophet. The key feature of a prophet is they stand alone. They stand alone. You should, my wife recently Googled, I hate AI. Okay, so please don't ever put this on my gravestone that he did some AI one time. But my wife recently Googled because she can't stand my tone sometimes. But she just recently Googled this. Um, what was the wording she used? Is it characteristic of a prophet to have a harsh tone? Is it characteristic of a prophet to have a harsh tone? She Googled that, and the AI results, she read it back to me, and she said, I actually now totally understand why you have the tone sometimes. It totally makes sense. But some people don't like it, and they can't handle the tone. Well, anyway, it's not just tone though. It's everything about what you have to do the right thing. And this is just the mess of human affairs in a sinful world. And you see the Americans struggling with this issue of executive power. They're freaked out by it. They're so freaked out. They're traumatized by what King George III has done. They don't want to replace him with another one. They're traumatized. Just like the people in France were traumatized, but then look what they did. The Americans had a different answer than what the French did. To their great credit, to our great credit, we were British and we had a much more measured Anglican, can I say it, middle way approach where we're just going to do the best we can and we're not going to become crazy like the French were. The French were totally crazy when they got rid of their king. And we didn't do that. We said we're going to just part ways. We're going to have boundaries. We're going to enforce these boundaries. We're going to try to make something better. And we're going to totally suck at it, and it's going to suck. It's going to be really hard. It did really help, though, that we have George Washington to look over there and just at least have an idea of someone who could possibly do a good job. And then we just got to make sure we get new guys like that. Try to build it into the system where we get new guys like that. So let me, so what Thach is doing here, okay, as a scholar, is he's checking out these old early state constitutions because they have executive powers, right? The governors. Well, they didn't call them, you know, um, the United States doesn't call our president a governor, but it the governor model fills a role, an educative role in helping us understand what executive power per se is on a more micro scale in this case in the states. So the okay, let me read that last sentence again so we can continue. The method of making appointments was exceptional. The pardon power was improperly divided. Okay, the positive recommendations of the result were moderate, but significant. The participation of the Senate as such and the business of the executive department should be eliminated. Okay. There's a lot there, man. There's a lot I could say about that. And that's another way of saying this. This is not a CEO with a board of trustees where they can override him. That's not what this is. The Senate is advisory only. They can advise him, and he might need their consent for some things, but it's eliminated for the maintaining of the day-to-day operations and the big picture things like that. So the Senate is important, but it's not an executive department. That's a key thing. They might be able to make some policy things. Okay, now I don't want to get too much into the Senate because we're at the state level here, and I don't want you to think we're talking about the U.S. Senate. We're not talking about the U.S. Senate. We're talking about Massachusetts here. And this is after, I know, this is after July 4th, 1776. So you're going to say that. This is not exactly about the 250th. Yes, yes, it is. Yes, it is. I do believe it is. Okay, now, the participation of the Senate as such in the business of the executive department should be eliminated, but in its place, and add page 34, advisory privy council should be installed. Okay, so they're still hanging on to this. We're so traumatized by executive power abuses. We are so traumatized. We still want a council. Now, the governor should possess the power to appoint and remove all militia officers. Sounds pretty good to me. Subject to the advice of his council, he should have complete control of calling the armed forces into service and of regulating them. The appointing power of the governor should be extended to include judges and the attorney general. Again, sounds great. And most important of all, the veto power should be given to him. I totally agree with that. Notice a lot of these were picked up in the federal constitution. Um, Let me say something about the attorney general there. That was not that was dropped. It was picked up in the federal constitution, but it was dropped for most states. Like California, the governor cannot appoint the attorney general in California. The attorney general is bottom up. It's elected. It's a separate elected office. I think that's a mistake. But, who am I? Okay, so the arguments on behalf of these changes will illustrate the influence of the experience of those states which enjoyed the doubtful blessing of uncontrolled popular assemblies. Oh my gosh. Full quotations seem justified concerning the veto power. The result, which is the name of the objection document to the proposed Constitution of Massachusetts, argued as follows. Okay. These are the revisions to the proposal of the executive department in Massachusetts. Quote, and this is a long quote, I warn you. We now want only to give the executive power a check upon the legislative. So there's the veto, to prevent the latter from encroaching on the former and stripping it of all its rights. Why would they want to do that? It's because the legislature is a disaster too. They have trauma from the parliament. The parliament was just as abusive as the king. So they're afraid. They're like, okay, we can't let the legislator do whatever the hell they want to do either. So what do we do? What do we do? How do we do it? You need a government. How do you do it? It's really hard. It's really hard. Takes a lot of patience and thought. This is not a fast process. Not fast. Okay, the legislative in all states hath attempted it where this check was wanting, and have prevailed, and the freedom of the state was thereby destroyed. That is to say, innocent third parties were hurt. The major function of the law is to protect innocent third parties. This attempt has resulted from that lust of domination, which in some degree influences all men and all bodies of men. The governor, therefore, with the consent of the Privy Council, may negative any law proposed to be enacted by the legislative body. Wow, that's amazing. The advantages which will attend the due use of this negative are that thereby the executive power will be preserved entire. The encroachments of the legislative will be repelled, and the powers of both properly balanced. All the business of the legislative body will be brought to one point and subject to an impartial consideration on a regular, consistent plan. As the governor will have it in his charge to state the situation of the government to the legislative body at the opening of every session, as far as his information will qualify him, therefore, he will now know officially all that has been done, with what design the laws were enacted, how far they have answered the proposed end, and what still remains to complete the intention of the legislative body. This is the background for the State of the Union, which was picked up in the federal Constitution. The reasons why he will not make an improper use of his negative are his annual election. See, re-election is good. It's not bad. You don't, term limits are bad because re-election is what motivates him to do the right thing because he wants to be reelected and he wants to get credit, and that's a good thing. You should be afraid of someone that doesn't want to get elected again, because why are they there? You know, um, I mean, it's not necessarily a bad thing to not want to be reelected, but I'm saying if you want to get reelected again, that means that you want to do a good job, right? And if someone doesn't want to get reelected, you have to wonder, does that mean you don't want to do a good job? It might, and that's a problem, is what this is saying. Okay, so the reasons why he will not make an improper use of his negative are his annual election, the annual election of the Privy Council by and out of the legislative body, his political character and honor are at stake. If he makes a proper use of his negative by preserving the executive powers entire, by pointing out any mistake in the laws which may escape any body of men through inattention, he will have the smiles of the people. We're on page 35 at the top. On the contrary, if he makes an improper use of his negative and wantonly opposes a law that is for the public good, his reputation and that of his privy council are forfeited, and they are disgracefully tumbled from their seats. Mm. This governor is not appointed by a king or his ministry, nor does he receive instructions from a party of men who are pursuing an interest diametrically opposite to the good of the state, and he knows he must soon return and sink to a level with the rest of the community. The danger is he will be too cautious of using his negative in the interest of the state. His fear of offending may prompt him, if he is a timid man, to yield up some parts of his executive powers. Notice they're saying that's a bad thing. They're saying, now remember, these people are traumatized by executive power from King George III and down the line. Okay. They're saying that they're learning from experience. And there's in Massachusetts example here, the danger of this plan that was proposed is that he will be too cautious of using his negative in the interest of the state. His fear of offending may prompt him, if he is a timid man, to yield up some parts of his executive powers. End quote. That's very enlightening. What you're seeing here is traumatized people who are traumatized by abuse of executive authority, to be sure, have also been traumatized by factions in a legislative body that thinks they can do whatever the hell they want to do just because of what they ate for breakfast that morning. And they have experience with both, and they think if push comes to shove on executive things, okay, that you got to give that one guy, you got to give him some breathing room here from the group. Does that make sense? And that was what was preserved in the federal constitution, which is what Thach is getting at here. Now, the arguments for gubernatorial control of the militia and exercise of the power of appointment are equally illuminating. We're still on Massachusetts revisions to the executive department proposed in the proposed constitution, Massachusetts. Quote, was one to propose a body of militia over which two generals with equal authority should have command, he would be laughed at. Should one pretend that the general should have no control over his subordinate officers, either to remove them or to supply their posts, he would be pitied for his ignorance of the subject he was discussing. Amen, bro. Amen. It is obviously necessary. Now, Thach is quoting the result, the capital R result, which was the criticism of the proposal of Massachusetts Constitution. They're pro- they're criticizing that. They say we got to fix that. That's wrong. So now it is obviously necessary that the man who calls the militia to action and assumes the military control of them in the field should precisely know the number of his men, their equipments and residence, and the talents and tempers of the several ranks of officers and their respective departments in the state, that he may wisely determine to whom the necessary orders are to be issued. Regular and particular returns of these requisites should be frequently made. Let it be inquired, are these returns to be made only to the legislative body or a branch of it which necessarily removes slow? Is the general to go to them for information, entreat them to remove an improper officer, and give him another they shall choose? And in fine, is he to supplicate his orders from them and constantly walk where their leading strings shall direct his steps? If so, where are the power and force of the militia? Where the Union? Where, quote, page 36 at the top, the dispatch and profound secrecy? They thought of secrecy as a key feature of executive power. That was preserved in the federal constitution as well. Why? But I'm talking about executive power per se, because there's gossip, man. And once gossip starts, it's almost impossible to try to rein it in when the lines of communication are multiplied exponentially with every person you add. So if it's two people, then there's one line of communication, right? You add a third person, how many lines of communication are there? If you add a fourth person, how many line of communications are there? You'll see it's increasing exponentially. And so some things are confidential and certain decisions have to be made very quickly. And if you are making the right decision, you will be rewarded later, or you'll be found out later, provided there's due process and the facts come out. But everybody understands this if you have any experience at all in administration. Now, I'm continuing the quote, right? Is this still a quote? Yeah, this is still a quote. This is a really long quote. Crap. Okay. Or shall these returns be made to him when he may see with his own eyes, be his own judge of the merit or demerit of his officers, discern their various talents and qualifications, and employ them as the service and defense of his country demand? It may be further observed here that if the subordinate civil or military executive officers are appointed by the legislative body or a branch of it, the former will become dependent upon the latter, and the necessary independence of either the legislative or executive powers upon the other is wanting. The legislative power will have that undue influence over the executive, which will amount to a control, for the latter will be their creatures and will fear their creatures. Amen. This is really good. Such is the temper of mankind. Wow, what a great line. See, the sin nature, man. That's biblical. It's very biblical. Such is the temper of mankind that each man will be liable to introduce his own friends and connections into office without regarding the public interest. If one man or a small number appoint their connections will probably be, if one man or a small number appoint, their connections will probably be introduced. If a large number appoint, all their connections will receive the same favor. The smaller the number appointing, the more contracting their connections, and for that reason, there will be a greater probability of better officers, as the connections of one man or a very small number can fill but a very few offices. When a small number of men have the appointment, or the management of any particular department, their conduct is accurately noticed. On any miscarriage or imprudence, the public resentment lies with weight. All the eyes of the people are converted to a point and produce that attention to their censure and the fear of misbehavior, which are the greatest security the state can have of the wisdom and prudence of its servants. This observation will strike us when we recollect that many a man will zealously promote an affair in a public assembly, of which he is but one of a large number, yet at the same time he would blush to be thought the sole author of it. For all these reasons, the supreme executive power should be rested in the hands of a small number. Okay, so they're not at one yet, who should have the appointment of all subordinate executive officers. Well, they're getting there. You can see the progression here. Now, page 37. Okay, that's an end quote there. Back to Thach. The Constitution finally adopted in 1780 AD, embodied many of the conservative ideas of the New York Constitution in respect to executive strength. Annual choice by the voters, a privy council for advising the governor in the executive department of the government, and for ordering and directing the affairs of the Commonwealth according to the laws of the land. The possession by the governor of military powers subject to the law, of the pardon power, a considerable portion of the civil appointing power, and most important of all, the qualified veto power. These were the chief features of the new executive. Now, those were all incredibly helpful for the people drafting the Constitution in 1787. It was evidently a compromise product of conservative wishes and popular prejudices. What about Massachusetts? I'm glad you asked. Page 37 in the middle. We'd like to thank Liberty Fund for making this available. We'd like to thank Charles C. Thach Jr. for writing it. Again, this is The Creation of the Presidency, 1775 to 1789, a study in constitutional history. Charles C. Thach Jr. It's Public Law 101. It's constitutional law. My Ph.D. is in public law and American politics. It's very interesting. Go out and get your copy today. Get a physical copy. Get this as soon as you can. Send Liberty Fund some money. Get it in the mail. Get it. Get it, get it, get it. Okay, let's continue. The same rise in prestige in the executive department in conservative circles, which is apparent in Massachusetts, is revealed by the constitutional history of New Hampshire, and also the same enduring popular jealousy of the chief magistrate. In January 1776, temporary governmental arrangements, there was nothing that deserves the name Constitution, were made, which included no formal provision for an executive department at all. Jeez. No, this is not going in a good direction here. The omission being supplied by an extra constitutional council of safety. What could possibly go wrong here? As in Massachusetts, this worked badly. I love that flat, just just flat tone. As in Massachusetts, this worked badly. In other words, that's another way of saying people died. Okay? People died. The expense of so large a body and the delay necessarily occasioned by the business of the executive department being entrusted to so great a number of persons have been too sensibly felt to require arguments on our part to convince you that an alteration in this respect will promote the interest of every individual in the community, declared one of the addresses that accompanied a proposed constitution. Page 38 at the top. Exactly the same note was struck by these addresses as in the Essex result. The growing importance of a well-constructed executive department is eloquently evidenced, for example, in the following excerpt in which it was declared to the voters, quote, This power is the active principle of all governments. It is the soul, and without it, the body politic is but a dead corpse. Its department is to put in execution all the laws enacted by the legislative body. It ought therefore to have the appointment of all the civil officers of the state. It is at the head of the militia, and therefore should have equally the appointment of all the military officers within the same. Its characteristic requisites are secrecy, vigor, and dispatch. Are you guys hearing this? Okay. This is a criticism of the New Hampshire. Okay. Its characteristic requisites are secrecy, vigor, and dispatch. Those exact terms are in the Federalist Papers talking about the presidency. The fewer persons, therefore, this supreme power is entrusted with, the greater probability there is that these requisites will be found. The convention, therefore, on the maturest deliberation, have thought it best to lodge this power in the hands of one, whom they have styled the governor. Cool. Good. Good, good. They have indeed arrayed him with honors. They have armed him with power. This is going in a good direction. This is good. And set him on high. But he is only the right hand of your power, the mirror of your majesty. Every possible provision is made to guard against the abuse of this high betrustment and protect the rights of the people. He can take no one step of importance without the advice of his privy council, and he is elected annually. Okay. The elected annually thing will change in the federal constitution because they'll say that's not enough time. That's just not enough time. Sometimes they take more than 1 year to figure out. Now, but this was too little. Continuing with this Essex result, this was too little. No one person is capable of being elected oftener than 3 years in 7. Every necessary and useful qualification is required in him in point of age, religion, residency, and fortune. In addition to all which, he is liable for every misconduct to be impeached, tried, and displaced by the two legislative branches. So there's the impeachment power, which gets picked up in the federal constitution, and is amenable to the laws besides, equally with the meanest subjects of the state. Thus controlled and checked against himself, the convention thought it reasonable and necessary that he in turn should have the right of objecting to and suspending, though not the absolute control of acts of that body, which they thought indispensably necessary to repel any encroachments on the executive power and preserve its independency. End quote. Page 39 at the top. Democratic forces in New Hampshire were too strong to permit either the adoption of the veto clause or even the retention of so hated a title as that of governor. For the rest, ultimately, the provisions of the Massachusetts Constitution were adopted. Okay, so what Thach just said was the veto power and the title of governor were not adopted in Massachusetts. These are mistakes. These are mistakes. Why? Because they're traumatized. They're too traumatized to think clearly and carefully about this. They have to learn by hard experience. The experiences with the state governments during the period following the cessation of hostilities served further to confirm these tendencies toward increasing confidence in the executive and increasing distrust of the legislature. Hmm. The distrust of the legislature is on full display in the Federalist Papers, pages 47 to 51, and just in general, right? I mean, they split the legislature in half, Senate and House of Representatives. You guys are different, and you guys got to fight with each other. So they made the legislature fight within themselves because that's how much they distrusted legislatures. Okay, so they've been traumatized by legislatures too. That is groups of people that just take it to be their duty to control everything. Um, now, um, the experiences with the state governments during the period following the cessation of hostilities served further to confirm these tendencies toward increasing the confidence in executive and increasing distrust of the legislature. War has a way of doing that. A review of those practical factors enumerated in the preceding chapter as the active causes of the convening of the Philadelphia Convention reveals the state legislatures as the main instruments of evil. Groups of people, undisciplined groups of people, the main instrument of evil. Undisciplined groups of people, they get together and they say, hey, guess what? When we vote about something, we can make stuff happen and we got the right idea. Yeah, they were considered the main instruments of evil correctly. It was these bodies which had originated and multiplied most of the difficulties which the Constitution was intended to remedy. From them came the paper money and debtor laws. It was also they who adopted the retaliatory commercial restrictions which played havoc with commercial prosperity. Especially it was true that the lower house proved the stronghold of the popular party. The experience of Massachusetts during the insurrection, that is Shays' Rebellion, is a case in point. Governor Bowdoin, sometimes called, I call him Bowdoin, acquitted himself well from the standpoint of the conservatives. His executive measures were vigorous, albeit moderate. The Senate supported the action of the executive wholeheartedly, but the House of Representatives proved a haven of refuge for the discontented. You know what I just realized? Oh man, I'm embarrassed here. I'm really embarrassed. I just realized I started on page 33, but last time we stopped at page 23. So I started 10 pages after we stopped last time, which means we were skipping the entire discussion of New York upon which this entire thing is predicated. I'll give you a summary of what we skipped. New York Constitution, good. One of the best for designing the federal Constitution. Why? Because whatever problems they had in New York, they understood executive power correctly. They understood what more of what was needed. And these other examples that didn't follow New York, big problems, which were corrected in the federal Constitution, but it took a long time of suffering. Okay, well, let's continue on this section and then I'll just do a separate, um, I'll post this first and then we'll fix that later by posting the previous one. I got to just make sure I write that in my notes. I'm sorry about that because I'm just realizing we're about done here with this chapter and we didn't even do New York Constitution, which is a really important one. So we're still on New Hampshire. Uh, the um, the experiences with state governments. Okay, sorry. It was these bodies which had originated and multiplied. Okay, we already did that one. Okay, experience of Massachusetts during the insurrection case. Sorry, we did that one too, Governor Bowdoin. His measures were vigorous, albeit moderate. The Senate supported the action of the executive wholeheartedly, but the House of Representatives proved a haven of refuge for the discontented. To this effect, writes the contemporary historian of the resurrection, of the insurrection. Wow, the resurrection, man. Sorry, Lord. The historian of the insurrection. While the Supreme Executive was employed in making the necessary military arrangements for the supporting for supporting the administration of justice. The House of Representatives remained in the same pacific disposition toward the insurgents. That is Shays' rebellion. Nothing of consequence was suffered to pass them, but what was connected with the grievances of the people. Okay, nothing of consequence was suffered to pass them, but what was connected with the grievances of the people. Such delays taking place in the effecting of a vigorous system for the authority of the laws occasioned very great alarms among those who were most opposed to the insurrections. They began to lose confidence in the general court and to wish that means might be found to adjourn them before the public cause should be injured by a feeble system which might tend to hold up their divisions and want of energy. There also began to arise, and this is still a quote, it's a quote from the Senate, I think. The Senate supported the action. Okay, no, this is a contemporary historian of the insurrection. So this is a contemporary person. It's a guy named Minot, published. There's no date. Well, you can find, I'll find the date later, but this guy, Minot, who wrote Insurrections, maybe it's in the back. I got to find this really quick. Minot, see if I can find it. Index of names, maybe. There's no bibliography. So there's an index. Maybe it's cited earlier. Let me look. I feel like I gotta find this. See, it's really important to have good footnotes, guys. Really important. Really important. I know all you IA people are Googling it right now, but I want to see if it's in this copy. If I was stranded on a desert island, could I find it? The name of it. I'm not seeing it. Oh boy. Come on, Liberty Fund. If someone happens to know where it is in this volume, let me know. Shoot me a text at my fax machine, and I usually doom scroll my faxes every night next to my payphone. All right, I can't find it. Some guy named Minot. That's weird. He cites it as if he's cited it before, and I don't see it. I must be missing something here. And there's no bibliography. What's going on here? Kramer, what is going on? Okay, guys, good bibliographies. They're not optional, people. Liberty Fund. I don't know why I didn't notice that before. It's really annoying me right now. Okay, so there also began to arise another class of men in the community. This is Minot, continuing on page 40 at the top, who gave very serious apprehensions to the advocates of a republican form of government. These, though few in number, and but the seeds of a party, consisted of persons respectable for their literature and their wealth. They were almost ready to assent to a revolution in hopes of erecting a political system more braced than the present and better calculated in their opinions to promote the peace and happiness of the citizens. Okay. This is where we're ending on Wednesday, 20 May, 2026 years after Jesus. but skipped page 23 to 33 by mistake. Okay. Um, I'm going to put oops just so I remember. Oops. Oops. Man, a tough week, guys. Tough week. So sorry. TRP 20 May 2026 years after Jesus. I'm going to put AD for short. Um, through top of page 40. But I'm going to put oops, skipped page 23 to 33. Go back, you idiot. All right. Thanks for joining me on the Republican Professor podcast. I've been your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. I've had a wonderful time with you on the Republican Professor podcast talking about this wonderful reflection on executive power per se, as well as how it was instantiated in the learning process, the learning curve that we had in the United States. The Creation of the Presidency, 1775 to 1789, a study in constitutional history by Charles C. Thach, Jr., published by Liberty Fund. Go out and get your copy today. Thanks for joining me. God bless you guys. Take good care. See you.